I'm in my basement and this bottle says 6 years old. I flip it over to the tax strip and I can prove it's actually closer to 8. And I paid $5.99 for it. I remember thinking nobody in that store knew what it was, and I almost felt guilty putting it on the counter. The guy behind the register, he didn't know, and I'll tell you, he didn't care. But he was tickled to get rid of it. Before I explain that bottle, and I will, I want to show you where bourbon stands today. 16.1 million barrels aging. That is an all-time record. Production cut 28% in 2025, the lowest since the pandemic. Jim Beam paused the entire Claremont distillery for all of 2026. And Brown-Forman, they laid off 650 people and closed their cooperage. There were about 50 craft distillers that went under in 2025 alone. And used barrels that used to sell for $200 18 months ago are now selling for $50. 300 million cases aging, 35 million cases sold each year. That's nearly 9 years of inventory sitting in Kentucky rickhouses right now. When I first heard that number, 16 million barrels, I just stopped because I heard something like it before. Picture Kentucky in the early 1970s. Distilleries are going full tilt, stills are going day and night, and warehouses are filling up. Bourbon was built on post-war optimism. Demand was strong, the future looked good, and everyone kept distilling. Until vodka happened. I always thought it was funny, the most American spirit losing ground to something that tastes like nothing. Clear spirits became fashionable. Your parents decided bourbon was something their grandfather drank. So demand softened, warehouses filled up, and distilleries running flat out suddenly had more whiskey than they knew what to do with. You would think the industry would slow down. Well, they didn't. They got weird. And you can almost feel the desperation in what happened next. Pick up a bowling pin, fill it with bourbon, put it on the shelf. When you can't sell bourbon as bourbon, you start selling it as a chest set. Jim Beam decanter, Wild Turkey collectible, genie bottle, bowling pins, train sets. The industry was throwing everything at the wall. Different glut, same desperation. But the strangest thing wasn't what happened outside the bottle. It was what happened inside. That's Wild Turkey's bonded warehouse A. I took that picture myself on one of my trips to Kentucky. The bottle and bond is a government standard going back to 1897. 100 proof, single distillery, single distillation season, and at least 4 years old in a federally bonded warehouse, like that one. That was Congress's guarantee of actually what was inside the bottle. Part of the system was the tax strip, the green stamp over the cap. You flip the bottle over, you find the strip, and it reads 2 dates. A distilled date and a bottled date, right there on the bottle. I have 4 bottles here, all bottle and bond, and all from the same glut period. Let me show you what the tax strips say. I found this one in a liquor store. I won't say where, but it looked like it hadn't been touched since the Carter administration. I'm walking down the aisles and I see this on a shelf among others, and I pull it down. I remember thinking, nobody knows what this is. This is Stillbrook. Old Fitzgerald Bottled and Bond, distilled at Stillbrook, DSP KY16, one of the most celebrated distilleries in bourbon history. Label says 6 years old, right on the back. I flip it over, but look at this. Distilled 1972, bottled 1980. That's 8 years old, not 6. When I first figured that out, I just stood there kind of doing the math over in my head. The whiskey sat there because nobody was buying. When the whiskey finally bottled, they labeled it at the minimum, even though what was in the bottle was considerably better. I put it on the counter, the guy rings it up, $5.99. I kept my face completely straight. He said, "Are you sure you want that old thing?" And I said, "Yeah, I think so." I'll tell you, he was tickled to get rid of it. That was the glut dividend. And what I paid for it, $5.99. And just so you know, it's still remarkable. Here's a bottle I have open. The text strip doesn't have the dates on it, but I venture to say it's also 8 years old. Fitzgerald bourbon that nobody wanted for $5.99. And it's still absolutely delicious. Same era, different store, different city. I'm working my way through Baltimore, store by store. I've got a list. Old Charter, Bottle and Bond, distilled at Bernheim Distillery, and bottled at what is now Buffalo Trace in Frankfurt. The label on the back says 7 years old. The tax strip tells a different story, just slightly. Distilled 1973, bottled 1981. 8 years, not 7. 2 different distilleries, same story. That wasn't coincidence. 2 of the most important names in bourbon today connected to one glut era bottle that sat on a shelf because nobody wanted it. I.W. Harper, one of America's most celebrated bourbons, shipped almost entirely to Japan during the glut era because Americans didn't want it. Since this is a bottle and bond, we're going to assume 4 years old. The tax strip is actually 7 years old instead of 4 years old. Rinse and repeat. Glut era whiskey, bottle and bond, Stillbrook corn whiskey. So we assume 4 years old, but it's actually 7 years old according to the tax strip. 4 bottles, Kentucky, Indiana, Illinois, bourbon and corn whiskey. Some of America's most prestigious labels, all labeled at the minimum, all aged considerably longer, all sitting on shelves because nobody was buying. I've shown these to people who have been collecting for decades and they just shake their heads. This wasn't one distillery making one unusual decision. This was the industry. Whiskey aging whether anyone wanted it or not. You see the pattern? I get a little, something when I line these up. The distillers are gone. The tax strips don't exist anymore. This specific window is closed. That was the glut dividend. Wild Turkey and Four Roses, Buffalo Trace, the ones you know today, they survived by making hard decisions. Some distilleries didn't make it though. I stood outside the Fitzgerald building, and it's a strange feeling knowing that what was made there is now gone. Fitzgerald, the distillery that made this Old Fitzgerald, stopped distilling in the early 1990s, sat abandoned for decades. Old Taylor ceased operations in the 1980s as well. It sat empty for 40 years. An Old Quaker in Indiana closed in the late 1980s, never to come back. The people that were making that whiskey didn't know there was a glut. They just kept doing their job, making bourbon, until one day they couldn't. So the question is, are we headed there again? Look at the shape of this. 1960s, optimism, expansion, running hard. The glut hits. Distilleries slow down, close, disappear. Inventory bottoms out around 2000. Then the bourbon boom. Demand surges. The industry rebuilds, expands again, runs hard again. And now, 300 million cases aging, 35 million sold annually. When I look at that chart, I think they did it again. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but bourbon has seen this movie before. The problem isn't collapsing demand. The problem is supply growing faster than demand. The stills don't slow down unless there's trouble ahead. And look at what happened to prices while all this was building. When I started getting serious about this hobby in maybe the mid to late 80s, bourbon was just bourbon. Nobody was camping outside liquor stores. Nobody was flipping bottles. I remember thinking BTAC was expensive at $45. I actually debated it. Everyday bourbon up 120%, roughly keeping pace with inflation. BTAC MSRP up 600%. Pappy on the secondary market up 1,400%. Median household income up 959%. I was buying BTAC for $45, walking into stores, picking it up off the shelf. No lottery, no wait list, no secondary market. I remember thinking I should probably buy more of these, and then thinking, nah, there'll always be more. Well, there wasn't. At some point, bourbon stopped being a drink and started behaving like an asset. That always ends the same way. This is from one trip to DC. I'm driving down a back street, pull over, and walk into a liquor store that hasn't changed since 1975. Guy behind the register looks at me like I'm lost, which is typically the look I got when I walked into a DC liquor store. I start pulling bottles off the shelf, and he says, "That stuff's been there since my dad owned the place." And I said, "Perfect." That's the playbook, finding stores that nobody is checking. 3 numbers tell the whole story. $5.99. An 8-year-old Stitzer Weller that nobody wanted. $45 BTAC off the shelf. No lottery, no wait list. 0 people lined up outside the liquor store. That window is closed now, but another may be opening up. Watch for discounting on mid-shelf and premium bottles. A bottle that's been, say, $60 for years, now $45. That's a signal. Watch for age statements quietly reappearing on bottles that haven't carried them in years. Watch for better availability on things that have been allocated forever. Buffalo Trace on the shelf, for instance. Pay attention to why. Watch for the mid-tier getting genuinely interesting again. That's where the glut dividend first shows up. And if you ever find a bottle and bond with the tax strip intact, flip it over. Find the distill date, find the bottle date, do the math. You might be holding something considerably older than the label suggests, and if the price is right, you know exactly what to do. That's not a trick. That's history. I've stood in these rick houses and walked these floors. I've poured from barrels that have been aging for years. And there's something about this hobby, something I find hard to put into words, that keeps pulling me back. The last bourbon glut was painful for the industry. Distilleries closed, brands disappeared, decades of history went quiet. But every time I walk past these old buildings, I think about the people who worked there, and I think about the bottles they left behind. For the drinker who was paying attention and patient, it was one of the best times in bourbon history just to go buy something good. I don't know if we're heading into another one, but if we are, you'll recognize it now, and you'll know what to do. I pick up this bottle sometimes to remind myself, the next bourbon cycle may not be about scarcity. It may be about patience. And patience may bring back something else collectors lost during the boom. But that's a conversation for another video. So remember, pour thoughtfully, draw slowly, and savor the journey. See you in the next one.